Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and what I want to do today is talk about Flask. Flask is a Python framework for doing Python projects, particularly web frame. It's a web framework for doing like web servers and things like that. So, if you've ever used Node.js and you've used the framework called Express, this is very similar. Has a very similar feel. It's a minimalist framework. It's not quite as like robust and batteries included as like Django for Python or Masonite for Python, or Ruby on Rails for Ruby, or Nest.js for JavaScript. It's more like okay, your fundamental piece, which is like being able to set up a server that's listening and routes, and you kind of take it from there. So let's walk through setting up a Python Flask project at its most simplest level. So I'm going to use like the most simplest virtual environment, the most simplest setup, and you can always just kind of develop your own thing from there. So now what we can do is you first have to create a virtual environment. You don't have to, but generally you don't want to install all your Python libraries in your global environment. You want to create a virtual environment to isolate what you need for that particular project. So the way you do that is you just do, now it's actually built into Python, so you don't have to download virtual env or add, virtual env to pip to pyenv, or you could use pip env. That's pip env is pretty awesome. But instead of trying to say, hey, you have to go download something else and make it complicated, Python now has its own built-in way of setting up virtual environments. And all it takes is you go python-m, and then you say we're going to use the venv module, and then you just give your environment a name. Okay, I'll just call it virtual env. Okay, so that way, and now watch what happens. It creates this folder called virtual env right here in my project. And then what I have to do is just run a script that's inside there that creates a virtual environment. So I just do source, okay, assuming you're in a bash terminal. Source, which means just, run this file as source code. Source dot slash virtual env slash bin. So there's going to be a folder called bin inside of it, which always stands for binary. So this is where binaries are sitting. And slash activate, because we're activating the virtual environment. And there we go. So you see our virtual environment is active, so we can see that in the prompt, in our shell prompt. Good. Which means I should have if I do pip list, I should have a pretty much bare bones version of an environment. See, nothing's really kind of installed. Very nice. So the only thing I want to install now is pip install Flask. Okay. And then again, anytime I want to leave my environment, I would just type in deactivate. So like, hey, I don't need this environment anymore. If I open up a new shell, it won't be in that environment. If I just can hit deactivate and see like that goes away. And if I want to reactivate it, I just run that command again. Okay, so you turn it on and off. So still a little bit more complicated than, let's say, using like package.json in Node, but I think it's a lot more straightforward than it used to be when you had to like install like virtual env and go through setting up all these environmental variables and all this stuff. That wasn't necessarily always the easiest thing to do. Cool. So there's that. Now that we have Flask installed, let's just create a basic Flask file. Okay, so I'm a holdover from JavaScript, so to me, usually like when you're creating a web server, that main file should be called server. So I'm going to create a server.py. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to import, well, from the Flask library, we're going to import the Flask class. Okay, and what this does, it creates the object that kind of runs the whole Megillah. So what we do here, pretty straightforward, is we have to create a application object. And that application object should equal the result of the Flask constructor. And then we pass the name to the Flask constructor. Okay, and I'm not gonna get too deep into this whole dunder. So whenever you see these like two underscores in Python, that's referred to as a dunder. So this is referred to as the dunder name variable. All these dunder things in Python are things that are like built into Python. So dunder name, if I remember right, just refers to the name of the file you are in. Unless this is the file you're running, then name will equal main. So that's a thing. It's just for like being able to track the context in which code is running. So you can always just say, hey, is the name main? If the name is main, then this code is running in the file that's being executed. If it's not main, then it's the file that is being imported or whatever. So this just allows Flask to do its thing, but it's just what you have to do. Okay, so here we're creating the application object. The application object now exists, and now we can start writing routes. And then writing a route is basically just created. You do a decorator, so you do app.route is the decorator, and then we sit there and say the endpoint slash, and then we have to say what methods this endpoint will be using. So we'll say get, and then that's that. Then we define a function. So I will call this our home route. The name of the function doesn't really matter, but probably doesn't hurt to have names that kind of symbolize what that route is. Like, dogs index, dogs show, or something like that. Okay, and then we just write the function. And whatever this function returns is the response. So we'll say return hello world. Pretty straightforward, and that's it. Okay, so that's sort of like as basic as it gets. Now to run the file, this part's a little weird. You have to do Flask. You have to define the Flask environmental variable. So it's Flask app equals, and then what it has to equal is the file in which the app object is created. Because what's going to do is I'm look in that file for this app object. It has to be called app, and basically build out, create a server from it. And then we're just saying Python Flask run, if I remember right. So it's Python, and I think it's like -m. -m means you're running a module, and the module is Flask. I always forget if it's Flask going to be uppercase or lowercase. We'll find out in a moment. But that's the idea there. So you're saying, hey, Python, I want you to run a module. So before we were running the VNV module, now we're running the Flask module because we installed Flask, so the Flask module is not a thing in this environment. And then the Flask module has a script called run, which will run whatever app is designated by this environmental variable. So I do that, and I already have a server running somewhere. Wonderful. I wonder if I do this. Port equals 5. By default, it defaults to port 5001. I wonder if I just put a port variable. Does it suddenly... Let me just run it on a different port, because I can hunt down the runaway port later. Python-m Flask run. That's still trying to bind it to 5000. Okay, fine. I'll just kill that port. So let me go find that command to kill the port. I have it right over here somewhere. Here we go. Well, I guess we can kill 3000 as well while we're at it. But really, I want to kill 5000. There we go. Okay, there we go. Our server is running. So let me open up a browser. If we go to localhost 5000, see, hello world. Yay! Pretty neat. Now we'd like to do more than just that, so what you could do is you could also return JSON by just returning a Python dictionary. So I could do something like this. I could just say, hey, response, well, it has to be a dictionary, and in Python you have to put quotation marks, response, and then the response can be like an array, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And since this is a dictionary, it'll treat it as JSON. So Control C. Now, if I go over here and refresh, wait, oh yeah, I don't have my extensions turned on. I turned off all my extensions. That's why that looks all sorts of ugly. So maybe turn on JSON viewer. Let me just go return on most of these. There we go. Oops. Make another new tab. Okay, Toby's back. Good. Localhost 5000. There we go. Now that looks better. Okay, so there we go. We have a nice JSON response. Okay, let's do something else. You could return templates. I'm not going to get into templates. I'm more of an API builder. But that's essentially the idea. Now, let's say we wanted to get like a URL param. Let's write a route that receives a URL param. So you can say app.route. And we'll say, just call this params as the root. Now the params are designated by this 1/2. I'll say method equals. We'll just use this for get and post. Okay. And then we do def params route. Again, the function name doesn't really matter, but I do have to pass the different params as arguments to this. So it'll be 1 and 2. And then we're going to say if, and then I want to test which kind of method it is. So for that, I'm going to need to import the request object. So from Flask, I also want to import the request. So unlike Node, the request object isn't something that's being passed into the function automatically. It's like something that kind of exists globally. It's threw me for a loop for a little bit. But basically, what I want to do is just say if request.method equals get, and then what I want to do is return a dictionary where 1 equals 1 and 2 equals 2, so we can see what our params are. And we'll leave it at that. Okay. So I say Control C, restart the server. And then now we're going to do is go to /param. I think what I called it. Let's just double check. I said /params. /params / blah 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 / blah 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 blah. Okay, and see there it was able to pull this first part of the URL as 1 because that's what I labeled that param as, and this is 2. Okay, cool, pretty straightforward. Now let's see if we can grab a query. So let's just also say query request.query. I think this is just the raw query string, but let's try it out. So we'll put a query at the end of the URL, and cheese equals Gouda. That's the query. Okay, we ran into an error. So now when I go back and I read an error, I can see here object of type bytes is not serializable. So I can't do that per se. Let me just do a quick search on that. How to do the request query is escaping me at the moment. Flask Python URL query. request.args.get. There we go. Okay. So it's an okay. So we'll say request.args.get, and we'll then have to pass cheese to it because that's the query that I called it. Okay. Let me just make sure that that's what I said. .get. Yep. And then we did pass a query. I'll have to restart the server. Control C. Go back here and let's see if that all worked. Yep. Oh, query says no. Oh, because the query's not there anymore. So cheese equals Gouda. There we go. Cool. Because again, anything after the question mark is referred to as a URL query. So this is the URL endpoint. So that's the part we specified when we were creating our routes. The query can be a sort of like variable. So that comes, it's just anything after the question mark. I'm passing arguments to my that's why they call it args. Cool. Now accessing the request body, we want to do that with a post request. So let's create if request method equals post. Okay, then what happens is that we need to get the request object or the body. So the body would be equal request.json. And then we'll just return the body. So you can see that the body comes in. There we go. So if it's a post request, we'll do that. Because the body should be a dictionary, so it should be just automatically serializable into JSON. Bottom line, for anything else, you either have to serialize it or just turn it into a dictionary, and then it's already serializable. And you have to make sure like the things inside the dictionary are serializable. So though, basically, you'd have to just double check to make sure that the dictionary's properties are either like numbers, booleans, scalar types in Python. Scalar types meaning like native types. Okay, local host 5000 / params / gibberish doesn't matter. And then we can send over some JSON as the body. Cheese Gouda. Okay. Oh, still a get request. So post request we did that with. And so we get cheese Gouda. Okay, so that's how you would access the request body. So I mean that's pretty much the gist. Like that's kind of the basics of just like how to there's other properties you can access, but I think you get the point. Every time you want to make a new route, you just do @app route, and then you specify the route, create a function for the route, and you just kind of go from there. It's pretty straightforward. My name is Alex Merced from Alex Merced Coder. This has been a mini crash course in Flask. I'll see you all later on. Again, make sure to go to devnursery.com and go join the Slack and Discord community. Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow me on Twitter at Alex Merced Coder. Follow me on LinkedIn and all that good stuff. You guys have a great day and enjoy.